Hello everyone. In today's class we are going to be talking about the Second World War, and in particular we're going to be focusing on not so much the ins and outs of the actual conflict itself, although we will paint some broad brushes about the main turning points in the war. But we're mostly going to be looking at the first part of the class on the build up to the war, why exactly war broke out, and in our next class we'll be talking about the Holocaust. So the Holocaust we won't be discussing in this class. We'll get to that in our next lecture. So when we talked about the First World War, we talked about the long build up to the war over 30 years, and raised the question about who was more responsible for the war. You might argue in the First World War that Germany had the most responsibility, but arguably other powers were held some responsibility as well. The Second World War, at least in the European sense, is much more straightforward. It's largely created by Adolf Hitler's foreign policy goals for Germany. In our last lecture, we talked about the rise of Adolf Hitler in Germany, got a little sense of some of his domestic policies. In this class, we are talking about his foreign policy and how that contributed, how that caused the Second World War. So Hitler, like a lot of Germans, believed that Germany had been betrayed in 1918. And what I mean by betrayed was that after the defeat of the German army, and there is no ambiguity, the German army was militarily defeated in 1918, a rumor was created by a lot of Germans who basically said that the army had not been defeated, and this rumor, I suppose, was possible because Germany had not been occupied by the Allies. The idea was that the army had not been defeated, but rather that weak leadership had surrendered while the war was still winnable, which any historian of the time period would tell you was incorrect. Indeed, the German general in charge in 1918, Ludendorff, had told the German government in August 1918, we need to make a peace deal. I mean, the army is spent. But nevertheless, a lot of people came to believe that there had been this great betrayal, and therefore the Peace Treaty of Versailles was seen as unduly humiliating, dictating peace to an army that had not actually been defeated. So therefore, Hitler's main goal as leader of Germany in the 1930s is to reverse the Treaty of Versailles and get rid of all the clauses that he did not like contained within it. This meant, firstly, rebuilding the German army, rebuilding the German navy, dismantling the various limitations upon the German military that had been imposed by Versailles. So there were some things that the Germans were not allowed to have an air force, they were not allowed to have submarines, they were only allowed to have a small navy and an army of up to 100,000 men, which, if you remember, in the First World War, in some battles, there was 300,000 or 400,000 people being killed, so 100,000 was relatively small. Hitler wanted to get rid of all those limitations and begin rearming the German military. He also believed in this kind of racial sense of German identity and basically felt that all the German speakers of Europe should be included into one giant German-speaking state. That would include, obviously, Germany, Austria, but also various pockets of German speakers across Europe. Well, even in parts of the Soviet Union, there were small areas where German was the main language spoken. So he was possibly talking about uniting all these German speakers into one single state. So this very much this racial sense of German nationalism and German national identity. And as part of that, he also believed that Germany needed what was called Lebensraum, or living space in the East. And this reflected Hitler's kind of social Darwinian understanding of nations, nationalism, and nation states. Basically, his idea was that all nations are in competition with one another for resources. Great nations need more resources in order to survive, to defeat their competitors, and ultimately to win the social Darwinian struggle amongst the various nation states. Therefore, in order for Germany to grow and prosper, it had to expand. In particular, Hitler felt it had to expand eastwards and conquering land there, so that as the German population grew, Germans could be settled in the east. And that meant that for the people who already lived there, the Slavic people of Poland and Ukraine, for example, they would either work as German slaves or eventually be eliminated from Lebensraum itself. Now, we'll talk about this more in our next class in particular, but he also planned to get rid of all the Jews, initially from Germany, and then later on, Europe. When I mean later on, is as Hitler began conquering parts of Europe, the plan changes to getting rid of all the Jews from Europe in general. And we'll talk a little bit about it. That did not necessarily mean in the beginning, in the early 1930s, that Hitler planned mass murder. As we'll see, the Nazi plan to mass murder Jews kind of evolves after the Second World War begins. But broadly speaking, one of his ambitions was to get rid of all the Jews from Germany, and also to destroy communism. Hitler believed ultimately that there was a massive ideological struggle taking place in the West between communism and fascism, and that if basically one side had to destroy the other, that the two sides could not coexist. So these are Hitler's kind of broad ambitions for Germany, and as we'll see, this is how they eventually create war in Europe. So we're going to talk about Hitler's specific foreign policy actions in the mid-1930s. Hitler was kind of very conscious in the or as soon as he came to power in Germany, that the United Kingdom and France, for different reasons, were not really willing to confront him if he were to try to roll back some aspects of the Treaty of Versailles. He sensed that Britain and France had their own domestic struggles, which they definitely did, and that there wasn't really a strong desire in either country to get involved in another conflict with Germany, and therefore that he could take advantage of this and expand and overthrow the Treaty of Versailles. There's different reasons why Britain and France were not willing to confront Hitler. France was actually much more aggressive. France was very willing to try and enforce the Treaty of Versailles. The problem was France was afraid that by itself it could not contain Germany, and therefore it required the support of the United Kingdom in order to keep Germany in check. The United Kingdom, on the other hand, the general feeling was that Germany had some genuine grievances, that the Treaty of Versailles had wronged Germany in certain ways, and therefore if the Germans corrected certain parts of the Treaty of Versailles, that wasn't seen as a bad thing, and the British were not willing to support France in a war over something they saw that had some amount of justice in it. So in 1935, Hitler announces that contrary to the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, the German army is going to expand beyond 100,000 men. It's going to have an air force, and it's basically going to remove all the limitations on its military that had been imposed at Versailles. And neither the British nor the French confront Hitler. The British, in part, because they felt that there was a certain amount of sense in the Germans rearming, especially given that to Germany's east, the Soviet Union, which they saw as a hostile power, existed. They felt that it was okay for Germany to have a bigger army to defend itself against possibly a Soviet invasion. The French were more interested in trying to confront Germany there and then, but without British support, they felt that it would be unwise to do so, and therefore they did not directly confront Hitler. That is not to say that the British and French were totally indifferent to the Germans rearming. In fact, the British, the French, and along with Hitler's Mussolini's Italy, met at a conference at a place called Stresa, Stresa, in Italy in the spring of 1935. And they basically said that, well, going forward, they would ensure that Germany did not break any more terms of the Treaty of Versailles, and were alluding to the possibility of military intervention against Hitler if he continued to break the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. You might be surprised that Mussolini sided with Britain and France in this, but bear in mind, Mussolini himself was a hyper-nationalistic dictator. When Hitler was talking about uniting all the German-speaking people of Europe, there were a small number of German speakers along the border between Italy and Austria, and so he kind of saw Hitler, at least initially, as more of a threat than a potential ally. And so he agrees with the British and French that, yeah, we will work together to confront Hitler if he does anything like this again. However, within a couple of months, the British had basically gone off and made a separate treaty between themselves and Hitler's Germany, saying that Hitler could rebuild his navy to 35% of the size of the British navy. And from the British point of view, they felt this was a good deal. This would, and assuming, of course, Hitler kept his word, this would mean that the British navy would remain much stronger than the German navy, and therefore, from the British point of view, they would have far less to worry about from a growing German army, a growing German military. However, this was a direct contravention of the Treaty of Versailles that was made in 1919, and it was also essentially going against everything that the British, the French, and Italians had decided at the Stresa front only 2 or 3 months earlier. So the French and the Italians both felt betrayed by the British when they made this treaty, and this is the beginning point when Mussolini starts to think the British and French will never confront Hitler. Maybe it's in Italy's best interest to work with Hitler rather than trying to oppose him, because the British and French basically won't stand up to him anyway. Then the big gamble Hitler made in early 1936 was with regard to the Rhineland. So if we look at this map here on the screen, to the left, or on the western fringe of Germany, there's a kind of a stripy zone. That was the Rhineland. By the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, initially the French occupied the Rhineland. They were supposed to occupy it until 1935, but the terms of that deal were changed in 1930, so the French withdrew from the Rhineland in 1930. But it was still supposed to remain demilitarized. That is to say that the Germans were not allowed to send soldiers into the Rhineland. And the reason for this was very simple. The French wanted the Rhineland to be demilitarized because if a war broke out between Germany and France, the idea would be that the French could push directly into Germany unchecked, and essentially the idea was that if a war was to be fought between Germany and France again, this time it would be fought in Germany, not fought in France, and France would avoid the economic and geographic catastrophe it had suffered due to Germany occupying the northeast of the country during the First World War. However, Hitler decided to gamble and send a small number of troops into the Rhineland in 1936. This was a big gamble. The German army at the time was of the consensus that if the French attacked, the German army was not strong enough to stand up to the French. The French contemplated invading Germany in response, but they realized that France itself was suffering a bad economic crisis in 1936 in the midst of the Great Depression. They calculated the cost of occupying Germany would be 30 million francs a day, which was too expensive, and the British did not support them. In fact, in Britain in particular, there was a strong sense that the Germans had real grievances. David Lloyd George, the former British Prime Minister, actually during the Treaty of Versailles, said that it was only natural for the Germans want to occupy the Rhineland. In fact, what Lloyd George specifically said was that Hitler would be a traitor to the Germans if he did not occupy the Rhineland. And he said this in part because in 1935, France had made an alliance with the Soviet Union, and that was Hitler's justification for occupying the Rhineland. He's saying we're being surrounded by hostile enemies, France and the Soviet Union, therefore I want to occupy the Rhineland. And some people in Britain felt that was a logical conclusion for Hitler to make, and therefore did not think it was Britain's place to interfere with Germany occupying the Rhineland. As one British politician said, this was as natural as English soldiers being moved into Cornwall in Western England. There was nothing to see here. Germany should be able to move its soldiers in. And this is the basis for the policy of appeasement, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit, but the basic idea was that Hitler and Germany had been wronged, well, not Hitler himself, but Germany had been wronged during the Treaty of Versailles, and therefore the British in particular were willing to make some concessions to the Germans, believing that the treaty was unfair anyway, and if that was the price of peace, it was a price worth paying.